Welcome to The Thing About Austen, a podcast about Jane Austen's world. I'm Zan.
And I'm Diane. And this episode, we're talking about special licenses. So the scene for this episode actually takes place right after the pin money scene from Pride and Prejudice that we discussed a few episodes ago. I mean, technically it's really the same scene, but just like slightly, just like a few sentences later. Mrs. Bennet has just learned about Lizzie and Darcy's engagement, and she has a whole list of things she is very excited about, in addition to the pin money.
Right. I mean, it is a list, right? So this is from the text. "My dearest child," she cried, "I can think of nothing else. 10,000 a year, and very likely more. 'Tis as good as a lord, and a special license. You must and shall be married by special license."
She's making plans.
I mean, she's gone from 0 to 60 very quickly.
Mm-hmm. As is her wont, yes.
Yeah.
So let's dive right in. What exactly is a special license, and why is it such a big deal that Mrs. Bennet is practically vibrating with excitement about it? A special license wasn't your average piece of marriage paperwork. This form of marriage license was relatively rare since it could only be issued by the Archbishop of Canterbury. And it cost a lot, but this license allowed a couple to marry anywhere and anytime as long as a Church of England or C of E clergyman performed the ceremony. So just like that one stipulation, but otherwise it's sort of a free-for-all.
Mm-hmm. And while that explanation covers the major details, it doesn't really explain the special part because, calling it a special license only makes sense if you understand what the not special marriage options were. So to get why a special license was so remarkable and why it would make a character like Mrs. Bennet nearly burst with social satisfaction, we've got to get some historical context, which means that in addition to special licenses, we will also be covering the bans, regular church weddings, and all of that. So this is a bit of a 2-for-1 episode for you all. And as always, our popular stipulation, we are not attorneys. And the language for all of this is a bit tricky since there is legal terminology, but there's also common vernacular. And so it does get a little bit wobbly. It does get mixed in together.
And this is one of our most requested topics. I mean, I feel like we should say that pretty much every episode we do from here on out is been requested by somebody. But this is for sure one of our most requested episodes, along with bands, weddings, all of that. So
yeah,
hopefully we're able to deliver.
Yes. No pressure.
No pressure. So join us, fellow time travelers, in England and Wales before 1753. Just like get in that little time machine. At this point in the 18th century, the rules for valid marriages were fairly loosely defined. According to Church of England canon laws, banns should be read, or there should be a marriage license, and the marriage should take place in the parish where one of the people getting married lived and be overseen by Anglican clergy, amongst other stipulations. That would be considered a regular, quote-unquote, regular marriage. And we'll get into the details of what all those elements mean in a few minutes.
So far, what we've described might not sound wildly different than what you were already expecting. However, the bans, the license, the ceremony at the church, these things were more like guidelines. They weren't actually mandatory. According to Rebecca Probert in her book, Marriage Law and Practice in the Long 18th Century, a Reassessment, the only real requirement for a valid marriage was that it was, quote, celebrated before an Anglican clergyman.
Probert goes on to explain that regular marriage refers to those that complied with all the stipulated formalities, while clandestine or irregular marriage describes ones that passed at least the minimum requirement of canon law, that they were celebrated before a clergyman. That's the minimum requirement. Both were considered valid marriages.
But because we have these two options, you start to see how defining and keeping track of marriages might get a bit squiffy. Like this is where we're getting into that blurry area.
There were a lot of irregular or clandestine, though technically still valid marriages as a result of these different loopholes. One prolific example of clandestine marriages were called fleet marriages. Probert explains that clergy imprisoned for debt in the Fleet prison could make money with little concern for penalty because, they're already in prison by performing these clandestine marriages.
So they just, take a fee and they perform a marriage because they're clergy and they can do that. And so Probert points out that these types of marriages were so prolific, there were so many of them, that, quote, it has been estimated that over half of London marriages in the 1740s took place within the area known as the Rules of the Fleet. Probert does go on to point out that these numbers, again, are hard to track, so the reliability is maybe a little bit much, but it does give you an idea of how much this was impacting marriage.
Yeah, there's quite a bit of we're married. No, we're married.
Yes.
Eve Taver Bannett, in her article, The Marriage Act of 1753, explains that, quote, at such wedding factories, as those at Fleet, clergy would ignore details like, quote, the age of the bride, to the length of time the couple had known each other, and to whether the couple exchanging vows was really quite sober.
Another example of irregular or clandestine marriages under this system is represented by a Mr. Creswell. He's going to be our case study, and he was a polygamist. According to Bannett, Creswell married 3 times and, quote, in absence of any real possibility of divorce, simply deserted wives and children when he grew tired of them and moved on.
What a nice guy. Wow.
He's a winner.
Yeah.
So obviously when Creswell's multiple marriages were discovered, his second and third wives were no longer considered legally married, and all of their children were no longer considered legitimate. So, yeah, not a good situation.
So cases like these became common enough that in 1753, the Act for the Better Preventing of Clandestine Marriage was passed. I really appreciate an act that tells you exactly what it's doing,
It's pretty direct. Yeah, I can appreciate this.
This is also called the Marriage Act of 1753, Lord Hardwicke's Act, or the Clandestine Marriage Act. So that's a lot of names that it goes by.
Yeah.
The bill had 3 primary goals. 1, to prevent rash marriages. 2, eliminate the frequency of polygamy. And 3, to restrain all commerce between the sexes except in marriage. We'll let the listeners define what commerce means to you.
But, it's an ambitious goal. We'll put it that way. Okay, so in order to achieve these goals, the bill standardized the requirements for marriage, combining secular and non-secular requirements for marriage to be considered legal and valid. As Roy and Leslie Adkins explain in their book, Jane Austen's England, quote, this act was the first statutory law to require a formal marriage ceremony. As a result, there were basically 3 standard ways to comply with the law for a valid C of E marriage. And worth pointing out here, Catholics were required to comply with C of E marriages until the 1830s. They kind of gained their own ceremonies, thanks in part to the repeal of the penal laws. But Quakers and Jews were granted exceptions. They didn't have to be married within the C of E. Everyone else, though, had to comply.
The first, simplest, and cheapest way to comply with the new bill was for individuals to have the banns read. This wasn't a new practice at all. In fact, according to the Oxford Dictionary of the Christian Church, quote, the custom of announcing a forthcoming marriage during divine service was probably taken over from pre-Christian practice, but really came into practice in England as a regular Christian practice in the 13th century. Then the Marriage Act standardized this practice.
So the word banns is actually Middle English and means proclamation, which is fitting because the banns, or the announcement of an intended marriage, was read from the resident's parish pulpit for 3 consecutive Sundays. During this time, anyone could voice an impediment, or the couple could decide against the marriage. They have this period of time where their marriage is kind of public news.
So, these bans, that would have really been an issue for Mr. Creswell with his multiple wives, right?
Right. I have an objection.
Yeah. He has a wife.
Yes.
Age was another thing people could object to during the reading of the bans. According to Atkins, quote, parental consent was required for anyone under the age of 21 marrying by license, but minors could marry by publication of the bans, though parents were at liberty to object. The age of consent was 14 for boys and 12 for girls, but most did not marry until their early 20s, even if they were betrothed at an earlier age.
Ugh. That's the right response, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. So after the bans were read, the marriage could take place within the next 3 months in the parish, presided over by an Anglican clergy in an Anglican church, and would be performed between the hours of 8 a.m. and noon. Then the marriage had to be recorded in the parish records, and then it is all legal. All of those stipulations had to be met.
Lord Hardwicke, whose name is most often attached to the Marriage Act, specifically wanted couples to pursue marriage by banns. He wrote to Archbishop Secker in 1754 that, quote, "the most desirable point of all was to induce the people of this country, as far as possible, to marry by banns," since this process was perceived as the best way to tackle the issue of rash marriages and polygamy. So he really was like, I want those banns read, so you have some time to think about it, and people have time to object. It's a lot harder to be impulsive or get away with polygamy if you have to tell the whole parish your intention multiple times.
Yep. Part of Hardwicke's incentive to make sure that as many people as possible were doing marriage by banns was that it was free. This was the free option. And so he really wanted that to be the thing that people chose. However, according to Keith Francis's article, Canon Law Meets Unintended Consequences, the Church of England and the Clandestine Marriage Act of 1753, marrying by publishing the bans was actually pretty slow to catch on. In fact, after the act went into effect, more people married using licenses than in previous years, and the bans didn't catch on significantly until the 19th century and after several additional reforms occurred to Hardwicke's bill.
That said, in Austen's novels, we have one specific mention of the bans in Sense and Sensibility. When Robert Ferrars hears Edward plans to take the living at Delaford, he apparently thinks it's hilarious. Austen writes, "The idea of Edward's being a clergyman and living in a small parsonage house diverted him beyond measure, and when to that was added the fanciful imagery of Edward reading prayers in a white surplice and publishing the banns of marriage between John Smith and Mary Brown, he could conceive nothing more ridiculous."
Wow.
What a gem. He's rude, he's a snob, he's,
let's see, he's an insensitive little prick all dressed up.
Yes.
And that's just scholarship,
That's a callback for longtime listeners.
So all of this information leads us to what was actually the second option for marriage under this new marriage bill. The quicker but more expensive alternative to the bans was to obtain a license. This wasn't a special license. This was the unspecial or common license. It wasn't actually called unspecial. It was just called common license. According to the Adkins, to get this license, quote, an allegation had to be sworn, usually by the groom, giving details of the couple and assurances of no impediments to the marriage. No, sir, I am not, in fact, married to somebody else.
They go on to explain that, quote, common licenses were issued by archbishops, bishops, and some archdeacons, or by clergy in certain parishes and officials acting on their behalf. A marriage was then permitted to take place within the jurisdiction of the person issuing the license, in one of the parishes named on the license, but the requirement to be married in a named parish was often ignored.
And so, yeah, if you were interested in getting married without having those bans read, this was an option. And in the mid-18th century, the common license cost 10 shillings on most occasions, according to Francis, although there were additional fees for administration.
In his book, What Jane Austen Ate and Charles Dickens Knew, Daniel Poole writes that in the 19th century, quote, for a few pounds, you could obtain a license either from a local clergyman or at Doctors' Commons in London, which would let you get married in a parish where one of the parties had lived for at least 15 days. Outside of very poor and rural areas, this would have been the usual way to get married for most of the century, and it avoided publication of the bans. So this common license would have been the likeliest option for most members of the upper class, the gentry, really anyone with more than a modicum of money and connections.
And while we don't have stats for the 19th century, we do have some stats about common licenses in the 18th century. So, for context, in 1765, 706 of the 730 licenses issued by the Archbishop of Canterbury's Master of Faculties were common licenses. That is over 96% of the licenses coming from that one individual, the only individual who's capable of providing two different types of licenses.
Yes.
So as compared, on the flip side, there were only 24 special licenses issued that year. That gives us an idea of the scale and popularity of these common licenses. So all of this information, now we know what the bands are, we know what the common license is. This finally brings us to that special license. We have arrived. Okay, so based on the Marriage Act, the only alternative to being married in a church between the hours of 8 a.m. and noon was to get a special license or to elope to Scotland, but that is an entirely different topic.
That will be covered in another episode, have no fear.
Yeah.
As mentioned previously, the only person who could issue a special license was the Archbishop of Canterbury, and even then there were some restrictions. Francis writes that, quote, sometime between 1754 and 1757, Archbishop Herring drew up a set of 5 rules to be observed when people applied for special licenses. These rules included limiting the privilege to the highest ranks of society, such as peers, privy councillors, judges of the King's Court at Westminster, and knights, mandating that the Archbishop be given 3 days to consider the application, and making diligent inquiry as to whether the parents, guardians, or nearest friends approved of the marriage. So you needed to be a fancy person to get one of these.
Yeah. You have to be on the list, basically. Yeah. So, first of all, you have to be on the list. But on top of these restrictions, there's also the matter of cost. According to Francis, a special license generally cost double that of a common license, which means in the mid-18th century, the cost was about 21 shillings with additional fees for the special license. And Poole writes that a special license cost, quote, a whacking great sum of 28 guineas in the middle of the 19th century. So there's definitely, you have to budget for this. This is not something that just anyone can afford.
As you can understand, these special licenses were pretty rare. For context, between 1751 and 1765, an average of 22 special licenses were issued each year. The lowest was 6, the highest was 50. So these licenses become a real status symbol.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And the biggest flex possible with a special license is that you can get married anywhere, anytime. Like that is the major benefit of getting one of these.
No 8 a.m. to noon for you.
That's
you're just
right. I will get married at 12:03. Thank you very much. So this basically meant that people who chose to have a special license usually meant to have a private wedding. In his book, Love and Marriage in the Age of Jane Austen, Rory Muir writes, these private weddings were generally held in the bride's home, usually in the drawing room, with only a few close family present. They still had to be performed by an Anglican clergyman. However, they might be held at any time of the day.
So evening weddings, then, are a real novelty. Muir gives the example of Harriet Cavendish, who married Granville Leveson Gower at Chiswick House at 8 p.m. on Christmas Eve, 1809, and they left for their honeymoon an hour later. So glamorous.
Wow.
8 p.m. on Christmas Eve?
You're special.
Yes.
I love the idea of doing it at twilight, love the evening. However, my favorite example from Muir's book is actually a couple who were interested in an early morning marriage. So the couple, Bobus Smith and Caroline Vernon, got married at 5:30 a.m. on December 9th, 1797. And then they set out for their honeymoon at 6 a.m., before the sun is even up.
They were ready to get the day started. I mean, and in December, it is pitch black outside.
Oh, yeah.
Other famous examples of individuals married in private ceremonies by special license include the Duchess of Devonshire, her sister, Lady Bessborough, and her 2 daughters, Georgiana, Countess of Morpeth, and Harriet Leveson Gower, Lady Granville.
What a time to be elite and marry whenever you want.
5:30 in the morning? It's not going to slow you down.
That's right. And I will get married next to this fish pond because I want to.
I would like to get married in the gardening shed. Okay?
That's right. All right. So all of this brings us back to Pride and Prejudice. And so now we have context on why Mrs. Bennet is getting really excited about this idea of the special license. It's exclusive. It's fashionable. And, it's special.
It's right there in the name.
So, as Muir writes, private weddings attained a social cachet, and Mrs. Bennet is very aware of that.
As Sandy Byrne puts it in her book, Jane Austen's Possessions and Dispossessions, quote, presumably, Mrs. Bennet wants to hasten the match, or perhaps to have it take place at a more grand location than their local parish church.
Byrne goes on to point out that, quote, it is possible to imagine that Mr. Darcy, who did not care to have his wife's portrait displayed to the public, might have felt equally fastidious about attending the Meryton Longbourn Parish Church to hear the locals exclaim over the announcement of his impending marriage.
And just a little bit of explanatory context there about the wife's portrait being displayed to the public. There is a letter that Jane Austen wrote to Cassandra where she was seeing an art exhibition and she found a portrait of a woman that she felt was a very good likeness of Jane. But she was unable to find somebody who kind of met her idea of what Lizzie would look like. And so her, in Jane Austen's way, her explanation to Cassandra is that, well, obviously Mr. Darcy would not want to have his wife's portrait displayed in public, Mr. Bingley's not so fastidious, he doesn't care.
Yeah. He's like, have you seen my gorgeous wife?
Exactly.
Here she is.
Yes. Much more in keeping with Bingley's personality.
Yeah, totally.
So while there's definitely some truth to Darcy wanting to keep things private, that does seem in keeping with his personality. A common license could negate a lot of that public speculation. So if Darcy and Lizzie wanted to keep things private, they had that option of not having the banns read without having to go for the full-on special license. Considering Darcy's wealth and status, it does seem probable that at the bare minimum, they would skip over the banns and go with some sort of a license.
Yeah. So it's going to be one of the licenses, obviously. And so if we're kind of talking about this idea of the special licenses, I mean, even if Mrs. Bennet is wildly excited about this and really encouraging Lizzie and Darcy to marry by special license, it's not a given that Darcy is going to be able to do that, right? We don't know if he could have even obtained one. He's not part of the peerage.
Yeah. He's got that in with his uncle, but that's,
Yeah. But, if we're looking at kind of the stipulations from earlier, he doesn't quite fit in that category. And, again, we don't know if he's secret besties with the Archbishop of Canterbury. So it's a pretty long shot that he would actually have gone this route. It's not impossible, but it's not the most likely scenario that he would have gone with a special license.
Considering both Darcy's personality and the difficulty of obtaining a special license, of the three options between bans, common license, special license, common license does seem the most likely.
Yeah.
So this is probably just one more instance of Mrs. Bennet being over the top, and she's very excited. She's swept away in the moment, and the idea of Mr. Darcy and his 10,000 pounds is just overwhelmed her. So she might not actually be thinking through the realities of obtaining a special license and exactly what that entails.
Yeah,
that's never really slowed her down.
So. Never. Yeah. But I think it is kind of more in keeping with her personality to just be obviously we'll do special license, and everybody's maybe slow your roll just a bit.
Right.
It's likely that Austen's readership at the time would have spotted that for what it is, right? They would have known that this was not the most likely scenario.
Right.
Okay, so to kind of round out our discussion, I think we do have to address the fact that Austen's father was in the clergy, and therefore, obviously, he would have performed these wedding ceremonies. So in most parishes, like Steventon, that are small, the marriages would have actually been relatively uncommon, just all marriages. I mean, it's not a big population that you're dealing with. According to Muir, quote, Mr. Austen performed only a handful of wedding services in a typical year in his 2 country parishes, although a busy city church might conduct several in a single day.
Well, as we know, back when you could get that fleet marriage, they were just...
Oh, yeah, just cranking them out.
Muir also points out that, quote, Austen's brothers all married in their bride's home parish, and there is no evidence that she attended any of these weddings. As her niece Caroline later remarked, weddings were then usually very quiet. The old fashion of festivity and publicity had quite gone by and was universally condemned as showing the great bad taste of all former generations.
Again, generation battles, nothing new.
So it's we have this kind of lull, right? It's there was the old-fashioned festivities, and then we have this period of keeping things sort of
fairly demure. Mm-hmm.
And then we have to wait a little while till we get back to the sort of pomp and circumstance of weddings coming to us from the Victorian era.
Yeah, absolutely. Muir also points out how this kind of quiet and subdued marriage ceremony and celebration may have been a common thing, but in Emma, Mrs. Elton is underwhelmed by this tradition. She's not impressed by Emma and Mr. Knightley's wedding. This is from that text. The wedding was very much like other weddings, where the parties have no taste for finery or parade. And Mrs. Elton, from the particulars detailed by her husband, thought it all extremely shabby and very inferior to her own. Very little white satin, very few lace veils, a most pitiful business. Selina would stare when she heard of it. You know, where is the ostentation?
Where is the pomp and circumstance? And there are some interesting things to say about wedding clothes, wedding trousseau, all that. Again, another one of our very highly requested topics. It's on the list. That's a separate episode.
Yeah.
So if you have read any number of historical fiction, historical romances, this comes up a lot. But the common license does seem to be the one that gets skipped over. Like it typically is either the banns are being read or like in a lot of historical romances. I mean, just like how in historical romances, there's a lot more dukes than actually existed during that time. There's also a lot more special licenses being handed out.
Statistically improbable amount of dukes.
Everybody's getting a special license and they're just getting it with no effort.
Like it's just like a dispensary, right? You just like go with your hand out to the archbishop and be like, hey, can I have one?
Yeah. So in actuality, it probably would have been a common license, right? That people would have been obtaining if they wanted to avoid having the bans read.
Yeah.
And we can't wrap up this episode without mentioning this bit from Austen's teenage writings that references pretty much everything we've been talking about. So this is from The Three Sisters. We then proceeded to other matters, and it was settled that they should be married as soon as the writings could be completed. Mary was very eager for a special license, and Mr. Watts talked of bans. A common license was at last agreed on. So, if you have any thoughts on the bans, special licenses, if you have a great family story of any of these, like for some of you who have that kind of family history, like we would love to hear about it.
Absolutely.
You can find us on Instagram at The Thing About Austen and on Twitter at Austen_things. You can also check out our website, thethingaboutaustin.com, and email us at thethingaboutaustin@gmail.com. And you can also check out our merch for the podcast on Redbubble. Go to aboutaustin.redbubble.com. And we have a listener review we wanted to read this week. We got kind of bad about reading listener reviews. I feel like there's a bunch of old ones that we never got around to reading, and I do feel bad about that. But then I'm like, oh, did we read this one or not? So, we promise we appreciate all of them so much. It really does make a huge difference. It really helps other people to find us, and we are always thrilled to get a new one.
Absolutely.
So this is from Juliac, who says, bringing new context to Austen. I love the rabbit holes this pod dives into. It has brought me more context and understanding of Austen's work, making me love it even more than I had before. Highly recommend. So
thank you.
Thank you so much. That is so nice. And again, if you would like to throw us a 5-star review, some kind words, it makes us glow from the inside out.
Yeah. And it's a really meaningful way to support the podcast. Yes. We appreciate that.
Absolutely.
Stay tuned for our next episode when we'll be talking about Many Down with Sarah Rose Kearns and Prerna Ramachandra.
Thanks for listening. Bye.